Hello and welcome back to my messy kitchen. It seems like I'm always talking to you guys from my kitchen when I'm cleaning it up. And just to answer any questions, I hurt my hand and I have some wounds here from a dog. I got in between my two dogs. They weren't biting at me, they were biting at each other, and I should never put my hands down, and I got bitten. I have a tetanus shot. It was a whole thing. So I just don't want to get my hand wet. To answer any questions about this, that's what's going on. So the last time we talked, I told you that I would talk to you about gardening when I lived in Kentucky. And as you recall, I've told you before, sorry, I'm putting my dishes away. I told you before that it's like living back in time when I lived there in the 80s and the 90s. So when we first lived there, 85, 84, 85, 1985, I had to learn. I knew how to work in a garden because my mom always had a garden, and us kids, we would go out there and we would pick tomatoes, and you plant marigolds around your garden to keep the bugs out and all kinds of things. But this was gardening on a whole different level. My husband taught me how to use a plow stock, and I'll put some pictures up here. A wooden plow stock. And that's what we plowed the ground with. We broke ground, and then we had to get the big dirt clods out and get a hoe, and we had to get those dirt clods apart so that we could have nice dirt to plant our garden in. But to that plow stock, we had a mule, and she was a Ginny mule, and he taught me how to use the reins to gee and haw. So when I first started that, I saw his furrows were very straight. April's kind of went like this because I was just learning. I was just learning how to do that. It was just fascinating to me. It was hard work, very hard work. And when we laid down at night, we slept because we were tired. It was hard work. So with the wooden plow stock in hand and the mule and the gears, had the gears over my shoulder, and I would had them in my hands as well, and would gee and haw left and right, and plowed the garden up next to the house. Then we would get, and it was a great big garden spot, but we would go get our beans and our corn. Now, this is something very useful that I learned from living in Kentucky. When you plant your, when you plant your corn, you put a few kernels of corn, but you also put your green beans in with that. So we would have a bag, and we would have the green beans in one bag and the corn in another, and it was over our shoulder, and we had it here like a sideways fanny pack type thing. And then we would take a stick. It was actually a backer stick, a tobacco stick, and we would make a hole in the dirt after the furrows were made, after the furrows, the lines where you want to plant were made. Then we'd walk and we'd put the stick there, make a hole, and then we would take corn and green beans, put them down in the hole and cover it up. And then we would take a can of water and put over the top of those. Now, I hadn't realized why we were doing it that way, but when it came time to harvest those, I realized the wisdom in that. So in Appalachia, in Kentucky, where we lived, we didn't have air conditioning, and it was hot. It was so hot because of the humidity. We were surrounded by greenery. It was absolutely lush and beautiful, but it was humid. It's like a tropical rainforest in the summertime. And in the summertime, we would weed the gardens. Of course, we had corn, we had green beans growing in the corn. And when the green beans started growing, the vines would climb up the corn stalks. And it would keep the green beans off of the ground to where they would not rot. That's ingenious. So as the green beans grew up the corn stalk, as the corn stalk grew, that another thing that was so good about that is when it came time to pick those, we could actually stand upright and pick. We didn't have to hunker over and pick them, and that was good on the back. We also planted cabbages and mustard greens and tomatoes. There was all kinds of things that we planted. I planted flowers. I always had irises and tulips and all the spring flowers like crocuses, and they were just beautiful. They would come up every year, of course, because they're bulbs. But back to the corn and the green beans. During the summer, when we would plant, during the spring when we planted, we would use bean bug dust. 7-7 is what it is, and it comes in a bag and it's white, and we'd have to go out there and put that white powder for insects. It was pesticide. Of course, we would water the garden and it would rain, but there was, like I said, a lot of humidity. It was so hot that when it came time to harvest the beans and the corn, it was July, end of July, August, and down there in Kentucky, that part of the summer is called when snakes go blind. It's hot, and when snakes go blind, in other words, snakes will strike at you, copperheads and things like that. My mother-in-law back in the day had killed some when she was out tending the backer and her garden, and she saw a copperhead, and she took a hoe and she cut its head off, because you don't want to be bitten by a snake. At least I don't. So good on Sally. But it was time to pick the green beans, and we had to wear long sleeves, even though it was hot outside. It was July hot in August. It was bad hot. And I'm talking about like 98, 99 degrees, and then you had like 78, 80%, 90% humidity on top of that. So it was a heat index of like 112. It was hot. It was so humid that at nighttime we had box fans in our windows of the house. And at night, during the day, we would turn the fans to pull air out of the house, the hot air out of the house. And at night, we would turn the fans around to pull the cool night air into the room. And when we woke up in the morning, the whole screen was covered with water, condensation. It was so humid, so humid. But when it came time to pick the beans, we had to wear long sleeves so that the fodder shocks, the corn husks the blades wouldn't cut our arms, and they can cut you, the blades of the corn. Excuse me. And then we'd wear a hat, and underneath the hat we would have like a rag with cool water on it on the top of our head to keep us from getting heat stroke. It was hot. I loved picking the green beans for this reason. If I got too hot, and I could tell when I was getting too hot because I would start actually getting cold, chills, and I knew I was getting too hot. Then I could hunker down to the ground, to the cool earth, where it was way cooler down there against the damp earth. And I would just hunker down there and put my palms of my hand on the dirt, and I would just sit there for a while. I would even bend my head down there and sit and cool off. And then I would stand up again and I would start picking beans. And then once we picked the beans, we would bring them to the front porch, and we would, this was our method for drying them. We would take the beans and we would snap them off of the vine. And then we would have a big quilt, and we would put them all on the big quilt. And sometimes we would put the quilt inside of a hot car with all the windows up and let the sun and the heat dry them. But we couldn't leave them in there overnight because the cool night air would come in and then they would mold. So we didn't want them to mold. Another thing that we did was we would string up the green beans. My husband had an old umbrella, and he pulled a spine off of an umbrella, the metal part, the spine. Those are about that long. And he fashioned the end of it and bore a hole in it to make it and he shaped the end of it really sharp. It was like a long needle. So we put some 10-pound fishing line in there. It was really heavy fishing line. And then we would string the green beans. We would put the beans on there and string. We had whole strings of green beans, and then we would hang them in the eaves of the porch at night to keep them off the ground, or even take them in the house and do that so that they wouldn't mold. We didn't want the beans sitting on each other to mold. So we would dry things that way. Now that's like going back in time. It was so fascinating to me. It was hard work, but it was very rewarding too. It was very, very rewarding. And I'm not going to talk much longer because we're going on 10 minutes here. I know people have things to do. But another fun thing we did was with the cabbages. We would all go out there into the field, and when it was time to get the cabbages, we would take the backer knives. The tobacco knives were like a machete, about that long, and it was a machete. And then we would take the cabbage heads, and we would cut them out of the field. And then we had a big table that was made out of a cable spool, a spool that would used to hold big thick cable. We would take the cabbages and we would chop them up on top of that. And there was a fire over by the creek, and that's where we had a huge kettle of hot water boiling. And then when the water was boiling, we would take the cabbage that we cut up. We had our clean canning jars, and we would put the cabbage inside those jars. And then we would put a great big portion of salt in on top of that. And then we would pour the hot water over the top of the cabbage to the top, about that far from the top. And then we would put the canning lid on top, and we would set those aside. And at night, as we were sitting on the porch stringing up green beans, we could hear pop, 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 pop. We could hear those lids sealing. And yeah, that's how we made sauerkraut and cabbage. And it was a lot of work, but we did it, and we had enough food to put up that to feed our kids and share with others. And it was wonderful. It was wonderful. And when we got one of those jars off the shelf, or got some of those green beans that we had dried out to use later on in the wintertime, we were so grateful that we had those things. And we learned to be very grateful for what we had, and we took great pride that we, along with God's help, had a harvest, and it was a bounteous harvest. So that's just a little bit of the gardening, from plowing the ground with a plow stalk and a mule, and planting and harvesting later on. And then we would put the food up, can it, dry it, freeze it, all kinds of things. So until next time, from April's Messy Kitchen, it's been a pleasure. Talk to you later. Bye.